Tudor Times, Southampton's only specific Tudor podcast. We would like to extend a warm greeting to all of our listeners. In this first episode, we will be looking at the life of Henry VIII through the objects he owned. Objects were clearly important to Henry VIII. His father, Henry VII, was careful with money and did not often show his wealth. However, Henry VIII has been remembered in history as a lavish king known for possessing many interesting and expensive objects. First, we will be looking at the lavishness of Henry's court by looking at one of his ornamental wine fountains at Hampton Court Palace with Joe McArdle and Hugh Raymer. Then we will be looking at Henry VIII's religiosity with Eleanor Joyce
and Christina Adamiak
by looking at his personal psalter. Then we'll be considering Henry VIII's political prowess by examining his suits of armour with Omar Always and Hugh Raymer. Finally, we'll be considering whether there was a Tudor revolution in government, as historians such as Elton state, by looking at Henry VIII's royal seal with Joe McArdle. Thank you for choosing to download today's podcast. For regular Tudor Times updates, follow us on our blog or on our Facebook page. The links to these will now appear on your screen. Our first discussion point will be to look at Henry VIII's ornamental wine fountain at Hampton Court Palace. In this section, we will be considering what the fountain can tell us about Henry VIII and his court, and more importantly, looking at the recent archaeological excavations at Hampton Court Palace in 2008, in which it was rediscovered. Objects are incredibly important. They say a lot about the people they belong to, as they can become part of your identity. The importance of objects has always been evident, even in Anglo-Saxon times, where people were buried with important objects they owned that would be useful in the afterlife. Therefore, as we look at Henry VIII through the objects he owned, it is important to consider what we can learn about him through these objects. However, it's also important to be critical of these objects. What can we learn? What do these objects not enable us to learn? To what extent can we interpret them? I have Joe and Hugh here who are going to help me explore this theme further. Joe, how important do you think objects are in helping us understand history?
That's an interesting question, and a theme that has been taken in many recent historiographical debates, such as in the BBC's recent history podcast series of the World in 100 Objects, compiled by Neil McGregor, or McGregor's Memory of the German Nation State, which became a successful British Museum exhibition in which he explores over 500 years of German history, primarily through objects.
If I may interrupt you there, Joe, if we look at objects as history, it's worth noting that objects make up the basis for most museums. So clearly, looking at objects is a good way to try and visualise historical events, as objects are tangible and easy for us to understand, and imagine ourselves into the past as well.
Thank you, Hugh. That's very true, and if we look at Hampton Court Palace as an example of a museum come palace, we can see that they have made sincere efforts to try and create exhibitions that present the Tudors as a tangible past.
So the object we'll be looking at here is Henry VIII's wine fountain, which has been recently reconstructed at Hampton Court Palace.
I suppose it is interesting on two levels. On one level, it tells us a lot about the extravagance of the Tudor court, but on the other, it shows how important objects are at explaining the past to the public. On your screens now, you'll see the wine fountain that was reconstructed in August 2010, which now is in the base courtyard of Hampton Court Palace.
So Joe, what do we know about when it was constructed and how did they discover it?
That's an interesting question. Its reconstruction has been inspired by the remains of a 16th century conduit or fountain during an archaeological dig undertaken at Hampton Court Palace in 2008. The new design is based off of research conducted by the Historical Palaces Association that looked at other ornate wine fountains that were used during festivals and celebrations of Henry VIII.
Hugh, is it purely ornamental?
No, it's not at all. It has red and white wine on weekends and bank holidays. The wine fountain provides a focal point to the base court, and this is part of the historic Royal Palace's ambition to bring the atmosphere back to this courtyard, especially as this is Henry's best known palace. In Tudor times, the base court was where the king's guests were welcomed and received by court officials. In early 2009, the courtyard was resurfaced, as the Victorian lawns were removed during the excavations. The new fountain, according to the Hampton Court Palace website, retains much of the old character that was lost during Victorian renovations.
If I might add to that, Dr. Kent Rawlinson, curator of historic buildings at Hampton Court Palace, said, Hampton Court was a pleasure palace for Henry VIII, where guests were entertained with spectacular revels and festivities, and wine and beer were drunk in enormous quantities, as evidenced by the great cellars that still survive here. Now, with the restoration of the base court and the introduction of our magnificent wine fountain, palace visitors can join a centuries-old tradition and raise a glass to King Henry at his famous royal residence. This is significant as the fountain significantly gives an idea of the magnificence of Henry's palace and tells us something about the king himself, that he was a lavish Tudor monarch who used the most modern technology to wow and entertain his guests.
How big is the fountain and what does it look like?
It's 4 meters tall and has been reconstructed from authentic materials such as timber, lead, bronze and gold leaf. It also sits on an octagonal base, which was exactly the shape of the dug-up excavations.
Joe, as this is a reconstruction, does it actually tell us anything about Henry VIII and what sources were used to create it?
An important source was the Field of Cloth and Gold painting, as this painting depicts Henry VIII meeting the French King Francis I at Hampton Court Palace. Both kings wished to outdo one another with cultural displays and entertainments, which is shown in the painting. In this painting there are many pop-up tents and 2 ornamental fountains, which you should be able to see zoomed in on your screens. Contemporary accounts of these fountains have provided further details of their features that have been recreated on the new fountain, including the motto Facite bone celle qui voldra, which translates as "Let he who wishes make a good cheer." Sorry, my Latin isn't very good. And classical friezes and the appearance of Bacchus, god of wine. The more intricate elements of the fountain cannot be seen, so the Tudor palace has also been used as an inspiration for the design. The fountain has 40 gilded lions' heads, which are copied from the terracotta roundels that decorate the outer walls of Hampton Court Palace, and the friezes are taken from the family of Henry VIII portrait on display at Hampton Court. It tells us a lot about Henry VIII, such as his desire to impress Francis I. However, it shows that Henry VIII used modern technology as a way to impress his guests.
Tell us a bit more about how the fountains were modern.
Well, Hampton Court Palace had an extremely sophisticated water system, which was supplied by buried lead pipes that came from springs 3 miles away at Coombe Hill. This served a number of fountains, which included an elaborate fountain built by Henry in Clock Court and a smaller fountain, or conduit, in Base Court. These were modern and impressive feats of engineering, as water was pumped from miles away to give the palace running water to be mixed with the wine in these taps.
Thank you, Joe and Hugh, for that interesting insight into the wine fountain. If Joe and Hugh have made you eager to visit the fountain for yourselves, head to www.hrp.org.uk/Hampton Court to find out the latest events and visiting hours. Now we turn to Eleanor to look at Henry VIII's religiosity by examining his personal psalter. Before Henry VIII became King of England, he was trained from a young age to become head of the church, and Eleanor reveals how religion was truly important for the king through his personal annotations. In modern Britain, religion and state are becoming increasingly disconnected. People often argue that religion is losing its relevance in modern life, where scientific explanations and increasingly secular societies provide arguments for religion slowly becoming obsolete. More recently, for example, Liberal Democrat leader Tim Farron has been heavily questioned about his Christian views on homosexuality, despite his protest that he is in the running to become the head of state, not head of the church. Henry VIII, however, fulfilled both these functions in Tudor England, and not only did he create the role of the head of the Church of England for himself, he appeared to have an abiding interest in the details of Scripture, as proven by his use of the Bible passage Leviticus to obtain divorce from his wife Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII's own psalter is an excellent example of the monarch's personal faith and a way to explore how he saw himself in relation to religious leaders before him. First of all, Eleanor, could you explain what a psalter actually is?
A psalter is a collection of psalms, the 150 ancient songs from the Old Testament that were allegedly written by King David himself. Many people learned to read using the psalms, and they were an integral part of Christian and Jewish worship during Henry VIII's reign. Many of them address the trials and nature of kingship, so much so that John Skelton described them as a mirror for princes. Therefore, Henry VIII's own copy of a Psalter with his handwritten notes is an invaluable insight into Henry's personal take on religion.
So, could you explain to us how Henry VIII came to own this particular book? How can the illustrations in this book help us to understand more about how Henry VIII viewed himself?
We estimate that it was commissioned between 1540 and 1542 by Henry VIII, as the books purchased by the king at the time were mostly Bibles and scholarly texts, which Alison Weir argues clearly show his interest in ecclesiastical study. He commissioned the Psalter from a French illuminator called Jean Mallard, who had worked for Henry's contemporary and rival, the French king Francis I. The book is highly compact and portable, which suggests to us that it was intended for use in the king's private devotions and religious study, as his notes in the margin testify.
Could you briefly tell us more about King David? You've mentioned him a lot, but why did Henry VIII want to identify himself with this particular monarch?
The book itself contains 7 ornate miniature scenes, and 2 of those show the king in the role as King David. He appears as a penitent sinner in one, and as King David defeating Goliath in another. Goliath bears a strong resemblance to the Pope at the time, Paul III, who excommunicated Henry in 1538, but it can clearly be seen that in Henry's opinion, his defeating Goliath reflected the sense of triumph he felt at establishing his own church and the perceived liberation of the English people. Other illustrations show more candid depictions of Henry playing the harp and reading in his bedroom, which is a far cry from the official portrait he had commissioned.
Tell us a little bit more about the notes that Henry VIII made.
King David was a hugely important figure in the Hebrew Bible, who, according to the Bible scholar Baruch Halpern, reigned from about 1010 to 970 BC. He was famous for not only being intellectual and composing the Psalms, but also as a poet, a musician, and warrior. As a self-styled Renaissance king, Henry VIII would have admired a monarch with such a diverse set of skills and would seek to emulate them wherever possible. There are almost uncanny similarities between the two kings. According to 1 Samuel 17:42, Henry shared David's ruddy countenance, and both were skilled at the harp. There were, however, less favourable parallels that Sir Thomas Wyatt intimated. For example, David sinned by seducing Bathsheba, causing the death of her husband Uriah on the battlefield, and he took 7 wives after discovering his wife Micah was barren. Neither king was without sin, and it is perhaps because of this, and their status as God's anointed despite their failings, that Henry VIII identified so strongly with the biblical king.
To conclude then, how does this Psalter tell us anything new about Henry VIII?
Henry appears confident that he has been set apart from the rest of his subjects, asserting, in Latin, "Note who is blessed," in his annotations. He is confident that his opponents will not go unpunished, adding next to Psalm 36, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, excellent advice." Some of the notes are quite poignant and serve to humanise the king, especially as they are written in his own hand. Next to verse 25 of Psalm 37, for example, which states, "I have been young and now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken," he adds in Latin a painful saying. This annotation was likely made towards the end of his life, when his jousting injury had led to painful swelling, obesity, and gout. Many of the Psalms actually express feelings of isolation and grief, emotions that Henry could almost certainly identify with. It clearly highlights Henry's more contemplative private side and his implicit acknowledgement through the parallels with King David that he had sinned, but he felt that he had sinned for good reason. The king's relationship with God is evidently a huge part of his life, and he continues to read the Bible in Latin rather than English even after the break with Rome, and his own statement sums up how useful this object is to us. In Psalm 21, "The king shall joy in thy strength," he added, "For the king trusteth in the Lord, and through the mercy of the Most High he shall not be moved." Henry's continuing belief that he was God's chosen king clearly shines through in this particular object.
So Christina, another focus on how Henry's Psalter alone makes him look like a religious man. Is that a fair assessment? Or taken with other evidence, does a new picture of the king emerge? So,
How did Henry incorporate religion into his married life? To begin with, this is the marriage certificate of Henry VIII and his wife Catherine of Aragon. This was Henry's first and longest marriage. It is fair to say that this marriage was somewhat genuine compared to his future marriages. His choices were often influenced by the possibility of political alliances. For example, with Anne, a marriage seemed desirable because she had German origins. Some of his choices also depended on his personal preferences. However, his main priority was to have a son. Establishing a new religion, committing adultery, annulling his marriage, and even being the cause for the execution of his wife, all became part of Henry's identity. This proved him to be a careless, selfish, unruly man. This is a photo of their annulment. It declared that Henry and Catherine of Aragon were not lawfully married. This was to dissolve the marriage between the two, allowing Henry to marry his second wife Anne, who was already pregnant with their future child. This was overlooked by many simply because Henry was the King of England. Overall,
Although it is believed that Henry made a decision of remarrying numerous times to have the chance of having a son to whom he can pass the crown on to, his personality is also to blame. Henry was never a loyal man, which is portrayed by his immoral actions regarding his wives and the church, which ultimately led to his downfall as a king.
That's a useful assessment. Clearly the king was religious, but he also used religion politically to gain more power in his marriages and through the Reformation. With this in mind,
Can you explain the link between Henry Salter and religion?
Continuing on from Henry VIII's Psalter book, the link between religion and Henry does not stop here. Although Henry portrayed himself as a sinner in some of the scenes in the Psalm book, he was clearly proud to establish his own church, portraying his passion for power and religion. Myths surrounded the character of Henry VIII throughout his reign. The king was painted on the cover of the Bible, translated from Latin to English. As you can see, he is painted in the center of the image by his most devoted painter, Heinz Holbein. However, Henry continued to read the Bible in the original Latin version. But why would the king make this decision, knowing that the translation was completed to honor him? Based on the evidences mentioned previously, it is obvious to state that Henry was a profound religious man. But questions still linger. Why did Henry have so many wives knowing it was against the Catholic Church? And what was truly the reason for the Reformation he decided upon in the strictly religious 16th century England?
Thank you, Eleanor.
and Christina,
That was a very interesting insight into the king's own religion. For more information on Tudor Christianity, why not read Susanna Liscombe's The King is Dead, which can be purchased from all good book retailers and gives an engaging account into the importance of religion for Henry VIII. Now we turn to Hugh and Omar, who will be discussing the importance of Henry VIII's political prowess through looking at his suits of armour. Armour is a physical representation of the king and gives a good indication of how the king wished others, especially his military rivals, to view him, and therefore this discussion will be important in considering a small element of Henry VIII's foreign policy.
So I personally feel that there is a common conception that Henry VIII was just a fat king, and I, throughout this discussion, would quite like to stray away from that.
I think that there's a great deal to learn from the armour that Henry VIII wore, because it furthers our knowledge and develops what we know of Henry VIII's character and his persona.
Yeah, and obviously armour is also really important because it gives you almost a realistic picture of what Henry looked like, because in a portrait is just like a painting of Henry VIII, and it can be like subject to a different kind of interpretation, and it can have like, different opinion regarding it.
And I guess it can actually be manipulated by Henry himself.
Yeah, and also armour, because armour is almost a copy of the king, if you know what I mean.
And I think a good example of this is in 1513 at the Battle of the Spurs.
Yeah.
The armour that Henry wore is very basic, so it shows what impression he was trying to give. The Battle of the Spurs is his first real campaign in France. It's very simplistic, very basic, something that his high nobility of his soldiers would wear, and it gives the interpretation throughout Europe that he is this warrior king and this king that's gonna fight with his troops.
Yeah.
A real leader.
Yeah. So I watched a video the other week, produced by the Royal Armouries, which is on their YouTube channel. And it looked at Henry's armour in the Field of Cloth and Gold, and it was quite interesting because one of the key elements highlighted was that it was heavily decorated, which almost shows, a slightly vainer side of the king, as well as obviously a much wealthier side, which, he might be trying to incorporate and as a result show off through his armour, which quite vain. Also, what is quite interesting as well is that the video also showed how his armour was pieced together in Milan, which obviously shows again how much Henry cared about his appearance and the quality of what he was wearing. He only wanted to be in the best. And lastly, I think a really interesting point as well is that the initial armour had to be changed because France changed the rules regarding the contest. So Henry, within 3 months, had to commission and have new armour put together, which, in my opinion, shows...
I guess it shows his diplomatic side.
Yeah, and it also shows the efficiency of his regime. I want this done now. I need it done before here. Please do it. And it shows the power that his demand had, and obviously his influence. Because if Henry wants something, then he's getting it, which just generally show how important he is, because they need to get it done for the king.
I guess it shows the power that his title did hold.
Yeah.
And I think this is partly because he uses his armour
Mm.
as another method of propaganda.
Yeah. What's also again quite important to mention is that if we look at the initial foot and combat armor put together for the event, the one that had to be changed, the dimensions of this suit are really impressive. He was around 6'1", which for that time was huge. It was extremely well fitted, as well as being extremely versatile. And when looking at this really does show for me two things. Firstly, how advanced his technology was for the time, and also how impressing and imposing he was. If we go back to his 6'1" frame, and at the time he's still a really athletic man. His waist was only around 34, 35 inches by that point. So he wasn't fat by any standards. He was still really athletic and fit. And I think that is something that doesn't really get considered very much. Loads of people said, "Oh, I think Henry VIII is fat. I think Henry VIII is a wife kid. I think he was lazy." But this armor really shows that he wasn't. And it needs to be I think we just really want to stress that he just was quite athletic, and he really cared about his appearance and the way he looked and how he presented himself.
Yeah, it's not just this conception we hinted at the beginning that he is just a fat king.
Yeah, exactly.
Because like I hinted to earlier, he uses his armor as propaganda.
Yeah.
So he would have to be quite intelligent about the ways he would go around using that.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, because obviously he wants to influence people and have them paint the kind of picture that he wants depicted. For example, his armor in he created an armor, a suit of armor in 1540, known as his Greenwich armor. And what was something which was quite impressive about it, it was known for having a larger codpiece than usual. Many argued, well, through my research, I gathered that some view this as being a symbol of masculinity and virility, which directly shows his want, for a son as a successful heir. And as we are aware, and as I'm sure many are through learning about Henry VIII through school, is that his main focus, if not, well, definitely one of his main priorities, if not his main priority, was to have male heir.
Yeah.
So I guess what you can say is that this suit of armor suggests that he's a powerful king who can still produce an heir. Quite a masculine image that he's trying to present.
Yeah, I think this is also apparent in his suit of armour in his second campaign of France towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
As alluded to earlier, after his accident where he got larger.
Yeah.
And compared to the armour that we talked about at the beginning of this, which was quite basic in his first campaign in France, this armour is a lot more decorative.
Yeah.
And like we've been saying throughout this, it points to his intelligence as well and how much he cared about his appearance. Because he wasn't as able to move around or potentially even fight in combat, this armour is decorative to show off his wealth, to show off his power to his men, so they still know he is this powerful king.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, throughout this podcast, we want to stress how armour can be representative of how Henry was not just a fat king. We want to depict him as being athletic and wealthy and virid in other lights. So his waistline did expand dramatically throughout his life, ranging from 36 inches to 51 inches. This is evidenced by his Wilton armour, his last ever armour, supposedly in 1544. This last campaign, this armour is significantly bigger, and what can also be seen is how his armour is a lot more decorative. Overall, what we're saying is that Henry's armour can be seen to be representative of him being a fat, lazy man. This looks at it through a much finer scope, and it blocks out
other aspects of his persona,
more realistic aspects.
Thank you, Hugh and Omar. That was an interesting insight into Henry VIII. Clearly, he was much more than just a lavish king, but these examples of his armour show how he was necessarily selective and involved in the armour he picked and commissioned for himself, as it demonstrated him to be a strong king, especially to his rivals such as Francis I of France. Finally, we turn to Joe to look at Henry VIII's royal seal. This is an especially interesting object, as while the historiography, or historical literature that has been produced on the subject surrounding Henry VIII is vast, the seal has been relatively neglected. The historian Elton uses the seal to argue that Henry VIII lacked political control. However, the seal arguably can be used to demonstrate Henry VIII's involvement in his domestic and fiscal policy, as Joe will explore.
Next, we will look at and analyse Henry VIII's royal seal. Seals were used on most documents in the past, to close them, and to prove that the document really was from the person who sent it. Technically, a seal is the equivalent of the modern-day envelope or postage date stamp, to ensure that the document would be secure and had not been tampered with. Most seals had a picture of the owner and a motto or legend around the edge. It would usually show the type of job the owner did and contain information about their family. The seal now shown on screen, for example, is portraying the symbol of the fleur-de-lis. However, a great seal was special. It belonged to the monarch, and all important business that the monarch did had the great seal attached. If a document had this seal on it, it had the monarch's seal of approval. It contained the monarch's wishes or commands. The Great Seal of England, as used by Henry VIII, was used to prove that important documents really came from Henry himself, to mark the sovereign's approval on significant state letters and papers. The legend around the edge, for example, stated, "Henry VIII, by the grace of God, of England and France and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, and on earth, of the English and Irish Church, supreme head." The next image is the Great Seal of Henry VIII. This is the obverse side, showing Henry on his throne, complete with the orb and sceptre. This imagery has been seen on the round table in the Winchester Great Hall as well, showing Henry's attempt to legitimise his reign. The next image is the reverse side of the Great Seal, which shows Henry charging into battle astride his horse. The seal was used on a letter from Henry to Edward Seymour, a knight, in which he granted an annuity of 50 marks. The use of the Great Seal is a clear demonstration of administrative and sovereign power in stately and governmental business. But in recent years, largely because of extensive research conducted by Sir Geoffrey Elton, a new view has emerged that Thomas Cromwell was a very capable administrator who brought in what was termed a revolution in government. Elton outlines that Thomas Cromwell had used the royal seal of Henry VIII on numerous occasions to give his own authority on stately documents. This is not the only theory of conspiring against the king on such matters. Susanna Lipscomb highlights the debate between historians that even during his last days, the king's will was tampered with by Edward Seymour and his evangelical faction to remove factional opponents such as the Duke of Norfolk and other conservative members of government. Elton was scrutinised for this, however. The statement that Cromwell chose the best positions in government for him to be appointed for, Master of the Rolls, Lord Privy Seal, and Principal Secretary. Lord Privy Seal was the position which held the Great Seal of the monarch. Other historians, including A.F. Pollard, give a lot more credit to Henry in his control over government, while J.J. Scarisbrick, although critical of the Henrician period, still returns agency of administration to Henry rather than Thomas Cromwell. Therefore, perhaps Cromwell's use of the royal seal has been exaggerated. The royal seal is important as it shows Henry's attempt at legitimising his reign as well as proving himself as a strong leader and administrator of government.
There seems to be little scholarship that specifically deals with the seal. Is there a reason for this? Because you gave a convincing argument that suggests that Henry had a lot more political involvement with these seals than perhaps other historians give him credit for.
Yes, throughout my research I found little scholarly material regarding the Great Seal. The main contributor for this seems to be from Eric Ives and his book, The Reign of Henry VIII, Politics, Policy and Piety. I believe there is little scholarship about the Great Seal because it is hard to determine which hand was using the seal at the time of patenting documents and whether it was indeed Henry VIII or Thomas Cromwell. And let's admit, when you say the name of Henry VIII, you don't first consider his use of the Great Seal of the realm. You might look at other aspects, such as the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, or his rich history of marriages. It is for this reason that I wanted to study the Great Seal in more detail and see what it could tell us about Henry VIII's political capability.
You've mentioned historians such as Elton, who think that Henry VIII didn't have much involvement with the seal, as there was a Tudor revolution in government. To what extent do you think seals such as these demonstrate Henry VIII's political prowess?
As I've mentioned, the Great Seal of the Realm was an important symbol of prerogative power. It was the monarch's final word on an order, and it was effectively his written command on a stately or government matter. We already know through historians such as Hutton that Henry VIII was a keen annotator. His stately documents had large gaps and margins so that he could scribble notes and write his thoughts. Henry VIII was also interested in parliamentary debates, but he was not bothered with the finer detail of government. He was more concerned with more important elements such as foreign policy, wars, and his religious reforms. Therefore, he would rely on a capable administrator such as Thomas Cromwell for the smaller matters. So perhaps it is not surprising to see that Cromwell might have in fact used the Great Seal at times when Henry was occupied with other engagements. But this does not mean that Henry VIII was a weak or even manipulated administrator within government, and he was still the primary user of the Great Seal, which certainly does demonstrate Henry VIII's political prowess, as it highlights his absolutist monarchy and sovereign rule.
Thank you, Joe. That was an interesting insight into the seal. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for choosing to tune in. Next week, we'll be looking at representations of Henry VIII in literature, such as in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. This podcast explores several key themes of Tudor history, such as Henry's skill as a political and military leader, the lavishness of the Tudor court, and Henry's religion. These themes will act as a springboard that we will refer back to in the rest of our series, as the first episode today acts as a basic grounding in some of the major themes of history in the Henrician period. We would love your feedback. Please message us on our blog or Facebook page, and don't forget to give us a follow to get instant updates on all the latest Tudor Times podcasts. Thank you for choosing to download today's podcast. Until next time.